Why is this question important? Well, if you look back at the history of Japan itself, you find that Japan actually tried to be somewhat egalitarian at the beginning of Meiji period, but except for education, perhaps it was abandoned, and big business in Japan developed, these family businesses, zaibatsu. Income inequality, in a sense, worsened, although we don't have good historical data. Militarism arose in the 30s, and it was only after the Second World War and with the land reform and the breakup of zaibatsu in Japan that income distribution became more equal. And that relatively more equal income distribution created two things. One, it created a more harmonious society, a society without so much day-to-day conflict and political crisis from economic causes. There could be political crisis from other causes, but not from economic causes. This is very important for developing countries because many of the political crises in developing countries actually come from unequal distribution of income and a perception on the part of many people in society that they do not live in fair societies. Rather, they think that they live in a society where a tiny elite actually gets most of the income, including what may come from foreign aid, and the rest of the people have to struggle as best as they can. So this creates many problems, including the problem of religious fundamentalism that I won't go into right now, but this is something that one has to keep in mind. The second aspect of equity is that it is a good in itself, one could argue. This is the way people like John Rawls, for example, who is one of the deepest thinkers about liberal democratic societies, have argued. Rawls argues, for example, in terms of what he calls primary goods, like education, citizenship rights, and certain other goods in society, that he insists should be equally distributed. Professor Sen, who won the Nobel Prize for economics in 1998, argues also that distribution should be in such a way that people's capabilities, what he calls people's capabilities, are equalized. That is, everybody's capacity to lead a good life, a life that does not suffer from unnecessary deprivations, so that diseases that can be avoided, and certainly things such as hunger could be avoided by everybody in society. So these considerations of equity are extremely important, one should say. Now there are societies which tend to ignore issues of equity more than others. In the US, for example, people are less sensitive to equity than in Scandinavian countries or even other West European countries. But even in the US, historically, ever since the Great Depression of the 30s, the government has been forced to face up to these issues, and even very conservative thinkers who sort of took the existence of inequality for granted have to come up with arguments justifying inequality. So even the US actually is somewhat defensive about justification of inequality. But many other societies in this world, I mentioned Western European societies already, but also former socialist societies and East Asian societies like Japan and South Korea and Taiwan and China also, which is both in East Asia and a former socialist, still officially socialist country. All these countries are much more egalitarian than the US. Even developing countries like India or Bangladesh or Indonesia or Thailand, anywhere in Southeast Asia, although there is tremendous inequality, it is not something that people like. So again, the issue of fairness or equity is important from this angle as well. So one needs to keep those things in mind. Another aspect of equity that I have only alluded to before when I talked about hunger is the idea of serious deprivation. When you're hungry, that means you have some very basic human need that is not being met. When you're homeless, it means that a very basic human need, namely shelter, is denied to you. You cannot have access. When you don't have adequate health care and you are sick, but you cannot go to the doctor or buy the medicine, also you have a very serious basic deprivation. If you are a child, this is especially serious. So generally, these kind of deprivations we can call the problem of poverty. That is, poverty is a situation where some very basic human needs cannot be met. So one aspect of equity for foreign aid is to really make sure that poverty is lessened, that poverty is alleviated. You may not be able to completely wipe out poverty, you may not be able to completely eradicate poverty, but you should be able to improve the condition of the poor in general and also make fewer people poor. So the poor people should be less poor, and also some people should not be poor at all as a result of giving foreign aid. Now, these are things that require very specific kind of projects and interventions, and I will try to indicate some of the directions in which this can go. Now, moving on then to the next point in my lecture, what are the goals of Japanese aid, or what should be the goals of Japanese aid? We saw the official declaration of the goals, which read nicely, and as I said, they should be given serious thought. So I think four things are worthwhile for us to think about. One is efficiency, which I already talked about somewhat. Another thing is equity, which I just talked about. But then also there are politics and economics and the combination of the two. Foreign aid is also a foreign policy instrument for Japan. And this is not something that is explicitly mentioned in the aid document, but it also is hinting at this aspect. But as you know, historically, Japan abandoned any kind of pursuit of warlike diplomacy, which is normal for other countries. So according to the peace constitution of Japan, it will never engage in any kind of foreign military adventure. If all the countries, I must say, adopted this kind of constitution and acted on this kind of constitution, then we will really have a very good world. So I like the Japanese constitution and I support it. I just hope that other countries would also adopt the same kind of constitution, especially my country, the United States. But because Japan does not pursue a normal kind of foreign policy, or is prevented from doing so, one might say, by the constitution, it actually uses foreign aid, or wants to use foreign aid as a major foreign policy instrument. So by giving foreign aid, it can encourage certain countries to behave in certain ways, and also it can discourage countries from behaving in certain other ways. But the main problem, of course, is that quite often the Japanese policymakers themselves don't seem to know what it is that Japan should be pursuing in terms of foreign policy. And because it appears to be so unclear in the minds of the policymakers themselves, the use of Japanese aid as a foreign policy instrument also appears kind of confused. And this is one of the most serious problems of Japanese foreign aid, I should say, from the point of view of international politics. But the relationship between politics and economics are also important, because as an economist, I can analyze the efficiency of aid giving. I can also analyze, as an economist of, say, Professor Sen's school, the equity of Japanese foreign aid giving. And I can try to understand the politics But this politics is also going to affect the economics from both sides, both from the Japanese side as well as from the other side. And again, going back to those principles that I showed you, it is clear that Japan is trying to prevent certain kinds of policies from taking place. For example, military or militarization of these societies. So one has to think of what kind of economics would best promote non-militarization of developing societies. To give you a simple example, if you build a road, for example, in a country, are you going to put it in a place where people actually can carry goods in case there is a flood, or in case there is famine and you need quick assistance? Or are you going to put it near the military base where the military can use it for emergency? So even non-economic aid can actually, non-military aid can become military aid if the project is not chosen carefully enough. And therefore, it is not enough just to look at the pure economics of the project. You also have to look at the relationship between the economics and politics of the project. And therefore, aid giving becomes a much more complicated affair than it appears to be. Okay, now let me go to my own paper and show you.
I have already done some.
Come here, sit down.
So I will introduce briefly Professor Khan's personal history. He is now here under our invitation program. But he will stay by 2nd of November. So this Friday, he will go to the Taiwan. Some undergraduate university in Taiwan after that. But today he will lecture some recent research on the theme. And he got a Bachelor of Arts from Haider College in state of New York. The distinction point about that is he got the summa cum laude.
日本語で言うとそのトップです。学年のトップということです。
His grade was excellent from Eisenhower College. After that, he entered the graduate school of Cornell University, and in 1983 he got a PhD from Cornell University. And his major was economics and mathematics in philosophy in Eisenhower College. After that, I guess that his major was turned into the economics in the graduate school. His current position is now the professor with tenure of International Business Economics, a graduate school of international studies at University of Denver. And he has been so familiar with the Japanese people because of his career, his distinguished career in concerning with the Asian area, is that he was he worked for the Asian Development Bank from 1997 to 98 as an economist. And after that, in 1999, he came to Tokyo work for the Asian Development Bank Institute as a visiting scholar. So he has known very well the Japanese current situation, including his acquaintance. And so we will expect he will show the very exciting lecture today. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Yunezawa, for that very kind introduction. I have to confess that I do not know as much about Japanese economy as all of you do. I have been looking at it from outside, as it were, and wondering what is going on. But of course, part of what you hear, I am told, both from inside and from outside, is that the current government is very interested in information technology. It started earlier, and I looked at some numbers, and numbers also confirm that research and development expenditures, for example, on information technology, however defined, I assume broadly defined, far outweighs research and development expenditures, for example, in space or in other industrial related sectors as well. So in today's talk, I will touch upon information technology and one or two aspects of Japanese economy, but not in any kind of detailed way. I hope that I can learn from you in these respects more than I already know. The title of the talk is Globalization, Information Technology, and Human Well-Being. And one might wonder, if there are necessary connections between these three. So it may be helpful to clarify at the beginning just the title. And I think everybody has an outline also. By globalization, I actually mean three things. It's a very confusing word, globalization, so I want to emphasize the things that I mean by it as opposed to what other people might. In my mind, there are really three aspects of globalization. The first is an increase in the volume of international trade. And this has been going on since the end of the Second World War. With WTO, the World Trade Organization, perhaps world has taken a qualitative leap towards formalizing in a global institutional way the increase in international trade. So in some sense, it is nothing new. The word globalization seems new in this respect. What is new is really WTO, the formation of this organization.
Excuse me?
Yeah.
When can I ask you questions?
Anytime, yeah. I don't mind being interrupted at all.
Then, most of this, how do you distinguish between the globalization and internationalization?
Yeah, actually, this is something that I can answer after the third point. International trade so far is really internationalization. The only globalization aspect, as I pointed out, is WTO. Okay, so that's the only difference. In international finance, I think the watershed here is 1971 to 1973. Prior to 1971, the world actually had a kind of watered down version of the Keynes plan, as many of you know. Keynes actually had suggested, even during the World War, in a famous memo that he wrote, of having a global central bank and a global currency and capital control, as long as there were nation states. Of course, the plan that resulted in Bretton Woods institutions in 1944 did not include the whole Keynes plan, but the idea of IMF basically is something similar to the Keynes plan, but as I said, a much watered down version and much more influenced by the US Treasury than Keynes or anybody else would have been comfortable with. So this is the globalization here really comes after 1971-73 with the demise of the Bretton Woods system. But again, this could also be called internationalization, right? Internationalization of capital flow. Right. So there is nothing globalized in per se here, except that the situation where we have both free trade and free capital flows takes us back to really a period before the First World War, except that we no longer have fixed exchange rate as in the gold standard, but more of a float or managed float or dirty float, whatever one chooses to call it. But this combined really do not make the economy itself a global one, with the exception again, as I said, of WTO. Now the third element that adds to it and creates the potential, and again I want to emphasize potential, of a global economy is the information technology revolution. So the third aspect of globalization is indeed something that is new in the sense that electronic transfer of information rapidly all over the world is qualitatively something that is quite new. Of course, up until the 1990s, nobody would have known this. So in my mind, globalization really didn't exist before the mid-90s. And today it exists really as a contradictory potential. It is not a reality. So that's why I think the form in which it is applied, globalization, as a process is very important to focus on, because it is really a process that has barely started, and we have to think about the implications, the further implications of this process. And institutional buildings, any kind of institutional building for this process really is at a very early stage. So what we have is a world economy that is much more international than before, with a few beginnings of global institutions, and a realization, for example, in the field of finance, that weakening institutions like IMF further after the demise of Bretton Woods probably was not a good idea, and that free capital flows by themselves really cannot be called globalization in a good sense. It is internationalization of financial markets, and it creates a few problems. And I was at Asian Development Bank when the Asian financial crisis started in 1997, which some people have called the first financial crisis of the 21st century. And in a sense, I think it is right. And I'm doing some separate work on this, and if you have questions, I can answer them later. But today, I want to focus on the third aspect of globalization, which is information technology. Okay. Any other questions about this term, globalization? Okay. Information technology is something that requires more precise definition, and when I come to the concrete aspect of my talk, I will define it concretely in the sense of which I see sectors actually are information technology and which are not. But broadly, at the beginning, we can think of it as more rapid flow of information in any form, but especially in the electronic form and digital form. Professor Yonezawa kindly lent me this book that came out a few years ago called Being Digital. I think many of you know that book by Negroponte.
Yeah.
And of course, Negroponte is a visionary person, so he sees everything being digital. But we are far from really that kind of digital system. But thanks to the people here, Mr. Uchino, Mr. Takahashi, we have been able to digitalize my presentation. But my speech, of course, is not digital. It is still my own and very much analog. So I want to be cautious about taking this idea of digital too far, too soon, although we may in the future get there, but today we are not there yet. The third term, human well-being, is also something that needs to be defined rigorously. And there are two approaches, I think, that are possible here. Among economists, the traditional approach is utilitarian approach, where we look at the utility consequences of consumption, ultimately. And to the extent that both globalization and information technology alters our consumption patterns, alters our leisure pattern, we can formulate at least the problem of well-being in utilitarian terms. But there is a second way also. It's a more messy way. Professor Sen was the first person to, I think, criticize in a rigorous way the problems of utilitarian social choice in his famous book on individual choice and collective behavior. And his position was that utility actually does not give us enough information about a person's well-being. So utilitarian approach, which he calls welfareist approach, is...
Why do you use the word well-being instead of welfare?
That is exactly the question I'm going to answer now. Because the utilitarian approach has been called by Amartya Sen and others the welfareist approach. And of course the traditional branch of welfare economics precisely does that. The problem was with the classical utilitarianism, basically you sum the utilities of individuals, right? That is the approach for, or cardinal utilitarian approach. The social welfare function is nothing but the addition of individual utilities, so it's an additive approach. But main weakness of this welfareism or welfare economics, according to Professor Sen and others, is that it ignores all other information than utility. And everything is converted into this utility, right? So it's a big assumption when you think about it, that everything that happens to us can be all ultimately converted into this one number, right? The utility number. So this is a very, very restrictive assumption, many people would say. So in the late 70s, many people wrote critiques. Then in the early 80s, Professor Sen introduced in his lectures in Amsterdam a new concept called capabilities. So from this capabilities perspective, and I will show some things on it later, the idea is to ask what it is that people actually do with goods, or what do goods do for people other than utility. And the answer is, for example, if I eat food, I eat food to be well nourished, right? I want something called nourishment out of food, so that I have energy, for example, to give this lecture, and you have energy to listen. Children can grow up in a healthy way and become able citizens. So this idea of functioning is very basic to this alternative approach. So every set of commodities, or more broadly, every set of social practices for individuals add to their functioning, or it may subtract also from their functioning. For example, pollution is something that subtracts from our functioning. We need to make up for it in some other way. So in his last book on this, Development as Freedom, Professor Sen explains that this capabilities and functionings approach actually is very close to the idea of freedom. It actually is the idea of positive freedom. That is, what it is that we can do or we can be in our lives, and how does the set of economic activities that we engage in as producers and consumers help us in achieving that freedom to be or to do. So this capabilities approach is much broader than the utilitarian approach. But in some ways, it is also much more specific to people's needs and functionings. So we can look at it in both ways. I am not opposed to the utilitarian approach because sometimes it's the quickest approach, and we already have a good literature on when it is applicable, when it is not applicable, what some of the problems are. But of course, we have to be very careful in simply applying the welfare theorems that we have, for example, from the utilitarian welfare theory, that every perfectly competitive equilibrium can be supported as a great optimal equilibrium, and every great optimal equilibrium with some redistribution of resources can be supported as a perfectly competitive equilibrium. We already know that these theorems do not hold in face of imperfect information. Right? Those are the Greenwald-Stiglitz theorems, for which, I guess, partly for which Stiglitz won the Nobel Prize. But we also know that